Good afternoon or good late morning, everybody. My name is Courtney Biscardi, and I am Executive Vice President for the Urban League of Broward County, but I also serve on the Board of Directors for the Community Reinvestment Alliance of South Florida, as well as the membership chair. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. But today we are here to welcome our speaker of the hour, Ms. Valda Valbrun. Valda is an established educational leader known for passion towards inclusive, research-based, and data-driven pedagogy. And as a system change facilitator, she has a proven track record of serving school districts and organizations to change practices and establish systems. You will soon see that she is a dynamic speaker, professional developer, teacher, administrator, entrepreneur, advocate, and student champion. Ms. Valbrun has also served as the Director of Professional Learning and as the Executive Director of Organizational Development for Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools in North Carolina, where she lives. And as an educational leader and equity specialist, she is a certified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory, which assesses intercultural competence. And Ms. Valbrun is also trained and certified in facilitative leadership for social change, which helps her clients as they manage issues of culture, class, equity, and confront systems that threaten inclusive practices, which we'll hear more about today. So we are thrilled to have Ms. Valbrun share her knowledge and lived experiences with us this morning. So without further ado, join me in welcoming Ms. Valda Valbrun.
Hi, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, let me just make sure that we're getting a sound here because I am going to show a video clip. And so I apologize for the technology delays. Let's see. All right. Everybody sees presenter view, or do you see the actual screen?
Looks like presenter view.
All right. I don't know how to get rid of that. Give me
we
one
will roll
more.
with you. Don't worry. It is just fine.
Let's see, swap displays. How's that?
Perfect.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you all so much for allowing me this time to talk to you. Couple of things. I just want to make sure that you're able to hear sound when I play a video clip. Share computer sound. Okay. We're gonna just keep rolling. All right, so welcome. My name is Valda Valbrun, and I'm happy to spend some time with you this afternoon to just kind of share a few things about myself, the work that I do, and really have a conversation about the impacts of racism on all of our communities of color. I think that what we're seeing now in the world is a convergence of so many factors, and so I want to spend our time together just really addressing some of these issues and unpacking them together. So I want to tell you a little bit about who I am. So in this picture, I am flanked by a bunch of beautiful children. And they are the class of 2032, which means that in this photo, they were kindergartners. And the reason why this photo is so important and so special to me is that I'm my best self when I'm in the service of children. And I think that for the most part, all of us who work in our communities are really in the service of children, creating the environments where they can thrive, where they can have the potential to go on and do great things. And so while I'm an educator by trade, this is my 29th year as an educator. I'm a lot of different things, right? I'm an entrepreneur, I'm the CEO of the Valbrun Consulting Group, but at my core, I feel like I'm an educator. And so I appreciate the opportunity to come today and to serve in that role, to be somewhat of a teacher as I share some things with you this afternoon. Our intentions for this afternoon are to really to help you to understand some of these intersections of racial inequities across all these systems: housing, healthcare, juvenile justice, especially education, and really think about some strategies that we can use to disrupt and dismantle these inequitable systems and engage in more equitable structures, policies, practices, and mindsets for the communities and stakeholders that we serve. So I like to start with a few guiding tenets, and these are the things that we know to be true, right? We know that to talk about equity without talking about race is disingenuous, right? The two do go hand in hand. There's a lot of talk about equity and creating equitable systems, and it's often had as a separate conversation with regard to the impacts of race. And so we know for sure that, to do so would be disingenuous. We also know for sure that schools as we know them, do not serve as the great equalizer, and nor were they ever intended to. Right? When schools were invented, they were not invented with the intent of serving children that look like me. We also know for sure that creating truly equitable communities is no longer just a matter of choice. You see what we're surrounded with right now, right? You've seen what it feels like, what these past few years have felt like. So at this point, I argue that it is a moral and an ethical imperative that we fix our communities so that we can create more equitable environments. We also know for sure that it is not enough to seek equity by just dismantling racism. We have to be intentionally anti-racist, right? We have to dismantle these systems and also think about what are the practices that we have to make sure that we're getting rid of, right? We also know for sure that our communities are complex ecosystems designed within the context of structural racism. I'm going to say that again. Our communities are complex ecosystems that are designed within the context of structural racism. Now, I say that because that's really what we're dealing with, right? There are systems that have been in place for many, many years that our communities are built around. When you think about housing and healthcare and social justice issues, all of these things are part of the way that our communities has been designed. And so I want to talk about those today. I want to start by sharing that I believe that words matter. And so because I believe that words matter, I want to spend a few minutes unpacking some language that I want us to rethink. So while we're in this talk, I want you to please feel free to engage in the chat. I have set aside a little bit of time for Q&A, but again, please use the chat. Okay, so many of us are now using the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Many companies have since hired, chief diversity, equity officer. And so I want us to unpack some of that language that has become commonplace, because what I'm hearing now is that people are using DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as if it's just one thing. So let's unpack it a little bit. So the term diversity is the first one that I like to help people explore, because we often think of diversity and equity and inclusion as one and the same, but they're not. Diversity is difference, but not different. That may not have been how you've heard it defined in the past, right? Fundamentally, we know that differences are neutral. It's society that ascribes differences that are not neutral. And so diversity includes that range of characteristics that we use to identify people, right? You look at me and you see a Black woman. And so, and people often say things like, our organization is very diverse. We're 28% diverse. Here's the thing. Diversity does not equal equity nor racial justice, right? It's not an excuse. You can't say, oh, we're a fair and just organization because we are diverse. So I want people to really think differently about the way that they use diversity. Diversity is counting people, but inclusion is making people count. Now think about that for a moment. When we say that we have an organization that's diverse, it may well be diverse in terms of representation, but how do we use that diversity? How do we include those voices? How do we ensure that we're planning for and considering the diversity of thought, diversity of experiences, diversity of worldviews? Oftentimes, you may have heard it described as being invited to the party, right? Versus being asked on the dance floor. And those are two very different things. So if diversity is counting people and inclusion is making people count, the way in which we include people is to create this sense of connectedness and belonging, and creating the conditions in our organizations where everybody feels accepted, valued, empowered, welcomed, and expected. Right? And that requires being very intentional. It's different than just saying, yes, we've hired for diversity. We have a diverse population of people that are part of our organization. Being inclusive requires action. And so being inclusive means that you do co-ownership, right? You share responsibility among all members of your organization, schools and communities. And it also means that you authorize individuals to carry out their roles successfully. You equip them with the skills, the knowledge, and the tools to be fully attending. You allow them to show up as themselves. I like to remind people that we are not a monolith. Persons of color are not a monolith. For example, you might look at me and you might say with confidence that I am a Black woman or an African American woman, right? Because that's how I show up. That's what I appear. I don't have an accent, and clearly my skin is brown, right? And so it's easy to assume that I am a African American woman. However, the assumption that I'm African American, right, leaves some things to chance, right? You would think that my lived experience is similar to other women who might look like me. And it isn't, because again, all people of color are not a monolith. I happen to be of Haitian descent. So I grew up in a Haitian household, eating Haitian food. I speak another language, and all those things are part of my culture, right? And so when you're being inclusive, you're recognizing that I may have a different lived experience than another African American woman. Right. And so you're planning for that. You're expecting that. You're allowing me to show up as my full self with my lived experience. And that's what we need to be doing to create truly inclusive environments, is recognizing that not everybody who maybe looks the same is the same. The other word that we toss around a lot lately, especially, is the word equity. And I want to give you a new definition of equity. So equity is a condition that balances two dimensions: fairness and inclusion. Now, that may be different than what you've heard of as a definition for equity before, right? And so as a function of fairness, equity implies that all people have what they need in order to reach their full potential. When you think about a function of inclusion, equity ensures that all of the programs, the services that we offer, the activities, the technologies are accessible to all, right? So equity is not equality. They too are often interchanged, and we want to make sure that people recognize that they're not the same. Equity is the expression of justice, ethics, and the absence of discrimination. I love that definition. And it's not the typical definition that you see when you open the dictionary and ask for, look up equity, right? You're not going to see that it's the expression of justice, ethics, and the absence of discrimination. That's powerful. Systemic equity is this complex combination of all these different elements that are designed to create, support, and sustain social justice, right? And we're part of these robust systems and processes that we hope will replicate equitable ideas, power, resources, strategies, conditions, habits, and outcomes. So in our respective roles, in education, in housing, in banking, in finance, there are so many pathways that we have to consider to create true equity. We often want to think of equity as, this balanced scale. And I challenge that. I challenge people to stop thinking that equity is that everybody gets the same, it's fair, it's balanced, right? I want to unpack equity for you a little bit. So let's look at this graphic that I have on the screen here. You might recognize the representation from the giving tree, right? What you see happening here is inequity, right? Inequality, because there's a tree, and that tree, for whatever reason, is leaning to one side, maybe because there's more sun on that side, right? And there's more fruit on that side. And we see two children in this case, trying to access the fruit from this tree, right? And so you might say, oh, okay, well, yeah, I see the tree is uneven, and oh, well, one child is going to have access and the other one is not. And so we said, let's fix that. Let's fix this unequal access to the opportunity to have an apple from the apple tree. And so we generally do this, right? We say, okay, I want to be fair. I'm going to provision you with what you need. And so now we've provisioned both of these children with the ladder. But there's still a problem, is there not? Right? There's still the problem. Now we're being fair. We've evenly distributed tools and assistance, right? That's that scale we said we want to have a balance. Right. And then we assume that providing that balance creates equity, but it doesn't. So I want to keep unpacking this picture. Now you see, they have what they need, right? And so now one child has a ladder that's a little bit taller to help them to access the opportunity. Most of us stop here. Most of us say, okay, I've created the pathway for equity. I've distributed the tools that are necessary for the individual to have success. And I argue that this is not enough, right? Because there's still something wrong here. Anybody want to tell us in the chat what might still be a problem in what we're seeing here on the photo? Let me open the chat. There's not enough fruit on the right. Absolutely, right? More apples on one side. Help is still needed. The resources, less apples. Absolutely, you guys are hitting the mark. So the thing is, right, what we see happening here is the systems that we're all a part of, we do the provisioning of the ladders. But I would argue that the tree trunk is representative of the system. Okay. And so let's see what happens when we fix the system. Look at that. So now we've done two things. We fixed the system. The system is the tree. We need to straighten out the tree. We need to straighten out these trees, right? That are all these systems that we're a part of, rather than to think that we only need to provision the resources. We need to do both. That's how you get to justice. You fix the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities, right? Now, there's a lot of metaphors here. The tools and opportunities can be, housing. They can be, jobs, right? It's like all of these systems. I'm using systems as lowercase systems that we're a part of. When this is done well, right, we get to liberation, we get to racial justice, we get to social justice, because we've not only fixed the system, but we've also provisioned what the participants in that system need in order to have access to it and to thrive. I love this analogy, and I just want some reactions from you all in the chat. What is this making you think differently than you probably thought maybe before 5 minutes ago, before we talked about this? Let me open the chat again. And empowerment to influence the system. Absolutely, I love that. This is amazing. Okay, I'm glad you like it, right? This is how I want us to be thinking, right? This is setting context for what I'm going to say for the remainder of our time together. I want you to continue to think about this systems, right? Each of you in your respective roles. What systems do you have access to? What systems are you part of facilitating? I would even say to you, what systems might you be colluding with that are inequitable in your respective roles? So think about your role. Someone said something really important in the chat just now that I was going to get to. Make sure there's a level field. Here's the thing about even this photo, right? If I could do a fifth panel, I would. We often assume that the ground beneath the ladder is level, and it isn't. Right? And so we can't always assume that, all right, well, both these kids have the same lived experience and they can both benefit from this 6-foot ladder, right? One child may be starting from ground that is less fertile, right? That is, that is rocky, that ladder will not be stable on. And we have to recognize that not everybody can function in that way. And we have to also think about the myth of meritocracy, right? Because oftentimes we say, well, I've given you a ladder, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, right? We have to think about, well, maybe it's not about the bootstraps. Maybe there's no laces. Maybe there's no boots, right? And so we really want to make sure that when we're provisioning the resources, we're examining the system, but we're also looking at how are people coming to that system. All right. Somebody says, Dr. Johnson, I think it goes further up. You're all talking, making sure that those who are disadvantaged have authority to make decisions. Yes. So great point, because you may have seen a graphic that was circulating for many years where it's children standing on boxes looking over a fence, right? It's been out there for years about equal versus equity. And I argue that even when they remove the fence, they remove the barrier, those students are still standing on the sidelines because they don't feel like they have the authority or they can't be in the game. So it's also about changing mindsets, right? We've got to be able to say, not only do you deserve access to these apples, I'm going to facilitate your ability to get apples, and I'm going to fix the system that prevented you from getting them in the first place. Very, very powerful. All right. So I'm glad you all agree. Let's keep on. So let's talk about some of these systems that threaten equity. When you look at the systems around us, right, we all in some way impact finance, housing, employment, health, government, criminal justice, and education. What we're seeing in our country now is the convergence of how all these things are interconnected and how many of them, most of them, adversely impact people who are already in marginalized communities, right? We're looking at how COVID has had a greater impact on communities of color. We're looking at, the issues of race and racism and social justice and this, the disparate outcomes that we're having. And so this correlation, this interconnectedness, we have to really think about it and unpack it and think about like, what are the impacts of these structural and institutional racism that have been going on for 400 years, right? They're not going to be easy to dismantle. I'm not saying that's easy, but we have to know what they are. We have to recognize them. So here are the levels of racism, right? And I always like to use these icebergs because there are things that we see on the surface, right, that we can easily recognize, but then there are other things that are beneath the surface, right? We can recognize interpersonal racism. We can understand internalized racism, but the institutional and structural racism are things that we don't notice as easily because they are not on the surface. They're below the surface. And so when we think about our role in being able to mitigate this, we have to be able to say, what am I not seeing in terms of these systems, right? They're all intersecting. There's an intersection now of where race, healthcare, wealth, housing, justice, and educational opportunity are all meeting, and they're all basically really crushing communities of color, right? And so I want us to be thinking about where do I think about yourself in your role, where do you have power and influence? Because sometimes it's not formal power or authority, right? And sometimes it's within your locus of control, within your sphere of influence. Where do you have the capacity to affect some change? So I want you to keep that as the question you mill around in your head as I talk. So I said earlier that we know for sure that communities are complex ecosystems that are designed within the context of structural racism. And we know that the impacts of structural racism on communities of color, really traditionally have harmed marginalized populations and puts them at increased risk when we're seeing that with COVID, right? So there's inequities in all these systems, right? Housing, employment, education, and healthcare. And if you were to further disaggregate that, you would see that not only within those marginalized populations of color, that when you are a person who is of a different sexual orientation or have different abilities, race, socioeconomics, gender, all those things are double and triple compounding. I want to show you a quick, a quick video, and then we'll unpack it. Are you able to hear?
Meet Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, and Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, and Jordan, and Jamie Johnson. Two beautiful babies born on the very same day. Each baby has a good chance of landing in a good place in life, as long as one of them doesn't lose the zip code lottery. Like 1 million babies each year, Jamie's been born into a low-income family. And since Jamie's mom lacked access to good prenatal care, Jamie is much smaller than Jordan. And since they won't have access to brain-developing activities found in high-quality childcare, low-income children like Jamie will be 2 times more likely to experience developmental delays. It probably won't surprise you that by their 3rd birthday, Jamie's been exposed to a lot fewer words than Jordan. A whole lot fewer. And I imagine Jamie's 4th birthday won't be much better. By the time they reach kindergarten, Jamie will have already fallen behind Jordan in language and pre-reading skills by 12 to 14 months. And getting to school on a regular basis will be perhaps Jamie's biggest challenge. Unfortunately, a myriad of health, transportation, and housing problems will cause between 5 and 7.5 million Jamies to be chronically absent this year. But with summer right around the corner, you'd think Jamie would have plenty of time to catch up with Jordan then. Sadly, summer presents new challenges for Jamie, a mountain of challenges. You see, every summer, Jordan's learning will evolve by a month because of access to libraries, field trips, and camps. while Jamie will lose 2 months of school learning every summer because good habits such as reading haven't been reinforced. By the time they reach 3rd grade, Jamie will be between 2 and 2.5 school years behind Jordan in critical reading skills. And how much more likely is Jamie to drop out than Jordan because he can't read at a 3rd grade level? 13 times more likely, and the results of which are frankly catastrophic. Wait just 1 minute there, folks. The story doesn't end right there. Fortunately for Jamie and Jordan and all of us, there's a whole lot of folks out there that believe neither luck, nor lottery, nor zip codes should dictate Jamie's future, who also believe that our schools can't do it alone. Luckily, there are leaders, organizations, and good people out there that are dedicated to believing in a whole lot more. The solution right now is relatively straightforward if we can commit to 4 things. Number 1, we need to make sure our kids are healthy and ready for school. Number 2, we need to ensure they grow up in a word and book-enriched environment. Number 3, we need to engage them in healthy and educational activities over the summer. Number 4, we need to make sure that Jamie attends school every single day, because at the end of the day, you and I both know that lotteries, zip codes, and plain old dumb luck don't really offer our children's future. We do.
So I see some comments in the chat. I will share the video link. It's on YouTube. A couple of things that I wanted to point out, right? So the video, while I think it's very powerful, I feel like towards the end, it puts the onus on schools. And I feel like I want us to think about which other systems contributed to the conditions that resulted in Jamie and Jordan having this very disparate distinction between their experiences and life trajectory. What we know is that there are social institutions and structures that transform these toxic ideologies into policies and practices, right? That restrict access to opportunity for minorities and particularly minority males, right? So Jamie and Jordan are 2 Black boys. And so I see in the chat box, you're saying, yes, healthcare, mom's access to healthcare, housing. There are so many systems that were just mentioned there. Any others? If Jamie's family is displaced from housing over and over, his ability to get to school consistently is jeopardized. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, while I think towards the end, it starts saying that we just have to have a campaign for literacy, that requires the entire community to come together. There's got to be good after school programs. We've got to fund libraries. We've got to make sure that kids are not living in book deserts and food deserts, right? So many different factors that converge here. And you see what happens is that most of that impacts our schools. I'm a former school principal, right? Worked at middle school and high school. And I recognize that when students come with having had all of these different impacts, the school is expected to be the sole place that we resolve that. I was one of those principals that I never allowed our teachers to say, well, if the parents would just, and if so-and-so would just, I always said, you know what? We have them here sometimes for 8 hours a day. We spend more waking hours with these students than their parents do. And while they're here, we need to give them everything they need, right? We don't want to be part of the system that's crooked, that allows for some kids to get and others to not get, right? So we have to think about where, again, within your various roles from the organizations that you represent, where are you part of the systems that contribute to this or that help to fix it? I want to talk about just in education for a moment, right? And I want to read a couple of things to you. So, look at these statistics that I have on screen here. Black students make up 18% of all preschoolers, but 50% of all preschool suspensions. That alone, preschool suspensions should alarm you, right? Why are we suspending kids that are in preschool, right? So there's that. Black students make up 16% of student enrollment, but 27% of students refer to law enforcement. We all know about the school to prison pipeline, right? Black girls are suspended at higher rates than girls of any other race or ethnicity. Black students are less likely to be placed in talent, talent programs, gifted and talented programs, and basically because we've got lower expectations from their teachers. 7% of Black students attending schools, where as many as 20% of the educators failed to meet licensure requirements. And we also know that we're not placing our more highly qualified teachers with the students that need them the most because we're rewarding those teachers. It was the exact opposite. If you were a great teacher, you were getting the kids that needed you the most. That's your reward. You do the work for the people who need it the most, right? Black students make up 31% of students arrested for committing an on-campus offense, despite making up just 16% of the student population. Here's the thing. Here's some more data for you. Black children represent 18% of preschool enrollment, but 48% of those who are out of school suspension. Boys receive more out of school suspension. Black students are suspended and expelled 3 times greater than white students. Now, here's the thing. If I were to substitute every time that I said the word Black for white, we would be in a state of emergency. Would we not? Right? Everybody would be very responsive to the fact that we have a problem. They would say, okay, you know what? Our white students are failing. Our white males are not accessing education. Our white males are being arrested and suspended. It would be seen as problematic. What we need to do is consider it a state of emergency for communities of color, that this data is what it is and has been what it's been for this long, right? And so we've got to be thinking about, okay, it is a state of emergency for us. If I were to say to you that half of high school dropouts report prison terms by age 30 and they were white, it would be problematic. If I were to say that more than half of high school dropouts were suspended at multiple points in their schooling, and that white males are 7 times more likely to receive out of school suspension, it would be a state of emergency. If I were to say to you that in the past decade, the number of white males arrested in schools nationally has tripled, we would consider it a state of emergency. Now, we're conditioned to kind of respond to some of the overt white supremacy we see. And by the way, when I use the term white supremacy, I really want to make sure that people see it as an academic term. Oftentimes I'll ask groups of people what comes to mind when I say white supremacy, and they say hoods and robes. They don't think of it as a system. It is a system. It is a system that is pervasive across our community, where one group is advantaged over another. It's simply that. That's the academic definition of it. And so we're able to respond to when we see it overtly, right? We know it's socially unacceptable for hate crimes and, using the N-word and that kind of thing. But I want us to be equally as aware of the fact that, when it happens, when it happens, when it happens, covertly, that we're not responding to it in those same ways. And so you see here that some of the ways that it happens in the systems, right? Hiring discrimination, predatory lending, discriminatory lending, right? Flags and monuments, not believing the experiences of people of color. So, good grief, my technology is not cooperating with me today. And you think about too, anti-immigration policies and practices. There are laws on the books, right, that essentially perpetuate these systems. And so we have to be able to recognize them and to be as equally outraged when we see these things happening. Mass incarceration, racist mascots, right? I think in the past year, we've, because it's been such a racial reckoning, people are becoming more aware. But I think awareness is just part of it. And we're going to get into, I see folks are putting in the chat, well, how do you fix it? How do you fix it? We're going to get into that, right? I'm following Kendi's model, right? Where you have to be able to name it and claim it and then dismantle it. So bringing in some current events, right? We know what happened on January 6th, right? And you see the headline here. It says, police respond to the Capitol brings claims of white privilege. Clearly, we have 2 very different justice systems. I'm outraged at what we've seen in the past few years, right? And I'm gonna give you a couple of examples from the headlines. So take a look at what I have on screen here. And I just want to point out a couple of things to you. Both of these from the same newspaper. Both of these are written by the same person, and they are within days apart. March 24th, 2015, March 23rd, 2015. Anybody want to tell me what's going on here? Put in the chat. What do we see? Oops, sorry. What do you see happening here? Anybody? They post mugshots for the person of color and not the white people. Yep, photos for one. Look at the language. Yeah, the photos are the big obvious one, right? But look at the language. Even in the sub captions, right? We've got 3 university wrestlers versus 4 arrested for burglary, right? We know more about these gentlemen, right? Just from the way that they've presented them here. They've got suits and ties on, right? And even if you look at, you probably can't see the small print, it says burglary charges are pending against 3 University of Iowa wrestlers arrested on alcohol related charges, right? So they've softened it. They're college students, they're well dressed, they were just drinking, boys will be boys, right? Other side, 4 men have been arrested in connection with the burglary investigation. According to police, criminal complaint shortly before 4 a.m. 5 suspects broke into a residence on Boston Way. Police said the suspects were looking for a gun. They stole a TV, $24 in cash, a cell phone, blah, 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 right? Very different ways of presenting it to us, right? And we have to be very critical consumers of media because the media plays into biases and creates greater inequities, right? We don't realize it, but we're absorbing this stuff, right? And it's creating in our minds a perception that makes Black men seem to be dangerous, right? And creates a level of innocence as it relates to persons who are non-Black, right? I want us to be aware of where are we part of, again, those systems where we allow this to happen, right? And I work with students and I tell them all the time, you got to be a very critical consumer of media because media is sending us messages that we don't even realize that we're internalizing. Income inequality. So I happen to live in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's where I'm coming to you from today, where we have a huge problem with income inequality. Now, I will say that Charlotte is the headquarters to Bank of America and Wells Fargo. So #2 financial kind of center next to New York. And you would, and if you've ever been here, you know that it's a growing city. It's quite prosperous. However, one of the things that we're seeing a great deal of is the impacts of income inequality. So much so that if you are born into poverty in Charlotte, you will likely stay in poverty. We currently have, and I invite you guys to Google this because you're going to be outraged by it. And I'm going to show you some pictures in a moment. We currently have a tent city in Charlotte in 2021. A tent city. You'll see pictures in a moment. Okay. Impacts of housing inequality. Now you can probably guess who was in the tents, right? Persons of color. Why? Because we've got neighborhoods being gentrified. They're being priced out. Banks are not providing them with loans. And so we have people who have had to resort to living in tents. We also know that our schools have been resegregated. That's actually impactful here in Charlotte as well, that many of our schools, while they may be high performing, you can tell by the neighborhood, you know, what that school will look like. And that's across the country that we've resegregated our schools. Now you see pictures like this and you say, oh, you know, redlining, that happened so long ago, right? That's the past, right? And you know, this is 1968. This is a pamphlet from the Urban League, you know, basically saying for sale whites only. And people want to believe that these things are in the past and that they're not happening now. But here we go. This is pictures from this month. That is Charlotte, North Carolina. And I'm outraged by it. That this is, and as of actually yesterday, because there was a rat infestation, they've they've moved everybody and they put them in hotels temporarily. Yeah, it is insane. It's insane. So, and I watched this happening. I watched one tent turn to 10 tents, turn to hundreds of tents. And people have been doing a lot to do outreach, and they put up porta johns, they put hand washing stations, they were giving out masks. Again, they were treating the symptoms and not fixing the system. Yeah, well, let's go give them food and water and hand sanitizer and masks, but we're not addressing the real issue, which is income inequality and housing inequality. So these pictures, you should be outraged by them. And this is Charlotte, North Carolina, right now as we speak. So here's what you see, right? We know that there are privileged and there are marginalized group patterns, right? Privileged groups have greater access, they make the rules. We've normed in this society, across all systems, we've normed whiteness. We've normed white middle class, right? And so we expect people to assimilate to that. In many cases, some people are neither white nor middle class. And if those systems are set up for folks who are white and middle class, those of us who are neither white nor middle class suffer greatly, right? And so privileged groups have all of these accesses to them, right? They're less aware of that, about being uninclusive. They don't recognize, discrimination, and they collude with, right? They collude with it, even if they don't, maybe don't feel the same way, but they benefit from it when you're privileged, right? And what we want to be thinking about is, how do we mitigate this? What happens to marginalized groups where they don't have power and resources, where they're seen as inferior, right? Where, they have to track their daily indignities, right? Because there's so much just happening to them. And they're punished if they challenge it, if they question it. And so we really want to be thinking about, okay, so how do we help fix this, right? So here's the call to action, right? So folks are saying in the chat box, okay, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? This is a system, these systems have been in place for 400 years. So they're not going to be dismantled overnight. And I'm a firm believer, and especially the work that I've been doing for the past few years has gotten even more important, because now I really shifted my conversation to telling people that, you know what, we have to work on not just, being fair and just and having cultural competence, but instead I've really shifted my language to what does it look like to be anti-racist. And so the call to action that I give to everybody is to start by really understanding the problem, right? And so, if you've not yet read How to Be an Anti-Racist, that's one place to start. But Ibram Kendi says that one either allows racial inequities to persevere as a racist or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist, right? And we've got to be all thinking about, in my role, within my sphere of influence, how can I challenge these systems and work as an anti-racist? Oops, sorry. And then he also says in the text too, that there is no in-between safe space of not racist. The claim of not racist neutrality is a mask for racism. I think that's powerful, is getting people to really recognize that it's not enough to stand on the sidelines. I know a lot of folks also say it's not Black people's work to help foster anti-racism, that it's not our work to do. I disagree. I think it's all of our work to do. But I think that as an educator, it's my responsibility to help educate people who are both of the dominant culture and Black, Indigenous people of color, to recognize and to call these things out when we see them. So where do we start? A couple of different things that I want people to be thinking about. You got to examine self first. Really, it's about looking in the mirror before we can look out the window. And I say that very sincerely, that we have to stop and think, what is my worldview? What are the biases that I have? What blind spots? And it may be, even as a person of color, I may have some blind spots that I don't recognize are allowing me to be part of the problem, right? And that could be as simple as not calling out inequities. It can be as simple as not educating those who need to be educated, right? So examine and practice what it means to take leadership for equity, given your own identity, right? And so thinking about, what does that mean? Examining what your worldview is based on your lived experience. How does that worldview show up in the way that you engage with others who are different from you? How does that worldview impact the way that you make decisions, set policies if you're a policymaker, right? How does that worldview manifest in the ways that you create and enact those policies and practices? Because oftentimes we will just say, well, that's the rule, right? And how do we not challenge that rule? I remember as a principal, I inherited a school that had a partial magnet. And it was so clear. All the kids that were in my partial magnet were white and Asian. And everybody else was Black. And I could have said, oh, well, they follow the strict criteria to get into this magnet. And what I did instead was I dismantled that. I said, no, this is not right. And so I said, I want to dismantle these policies and practices that are precluding children of color from access to more rigorous curriculum. How does that worldview manifest in the ways that you lead? Many of us are parts of organizations across these systems. So I want you to think about your own worldview and how does it show up in the way that you do your job? And then consider your own personal biases. Who do you tend to involve in decision-making? Who do you hold as the standard? Especially when you're in crunch time, who are you talking to get information? So there's an activity that I like to remind people to do. You can actually Google this, but it's just really finding out who's in your world. Many of us engage with people who look like us, right? And we know that race is a social construct. And so there's real consequences and effects to that, right? Many of us will engage with people who look like us. We might work with people who look like us, go to church people who look like us, right? And so we may have an entire group of people who we've never been exposed to. So we may not know anybody who's of the LGBT population, or don't know anybody who's a veteran, or anybody who's disabled, or anybody who's a Muslim, whatever it is. When we have those gaps in our experience, it shows up in us having blind spots. What you don't know, right, you tend to see in a negative way, or in a way that is counter to your own belief system. So I always challenge people to think about your own diversity profile, right? And think about how am I exposed to people? I'm going to share with you 4 E's: exposure, experience, education, to get to empathy. But this is really getting you to get to that exposure. I need to expose myself to difference so that I can expand my worldview. The other thing that you should be doing is developing meaningful and productive cross-cultural relationships across difference, right? The only way to really expand your horizons around difference is to have that level of exposure, and to engage with people in meaningful ways. What we tend to do instead is we find our commonalities with people, right? People I work with, they may look like me, they may not look like me, but we focus on relationships that are built on what we have as shared experience. And so we want to challenge that. We want to move out of that zone of comfort and really get to understand people who are different than us. So when you do that, I want you to think about, in your workplace, for example, how does your team work together to plan for and bridge across difference? How does a team engage with cross-cultural stakeholders? And how do you create inclusive environments for high performance? Remember, I said earlier that being inclusive requires action, right? It's not just the being invited to the table, it's also being asked your opinions, your thoughts, your lived experience, without the expectation that you will agree with everybody else. It's feeling safe and saying, well, in my experience, here's how that lands on me, for example. We also want to be thinking about how we dismantle those systems. Earlier in the chat, someone said dismantling is the hard part, right? But it's hard when you think about trying to do it as one foul swoop. The reason why I say, dismantle instead of disrupt, right? Because disruption is chaotic. Disruption causes harm. Dismantling is so much more intentional. It's like taking little pieces apart, right? And so when you dismantle, you're way more intentional. So when I say dismantle inequitable systems, it's really thinking about how do I closely examine the systems that I'm a part of? And then where do I see elements that I can begin to dismantle slowly, to pick apart, right? Because there are so many other cogs, if you see in the display here, there are so many cogs that have to work in concert. And if we remove one cog that we know is inequitable, it will halt some of the other systems. And that's what we want. That's what we call dismantling, right? So use human-centered processes and tools that foster co-ownership, mutual accountability, and equity. The other thing I want you to think about is we need to stop doing minimization, right? We need to stop minimizing difference. We are trained to minimize. I do this assessment called the Intercultural Development Inventory. Some of you may have taken it, but we are trained to minimize. Minimization is when we focus on the things that we have in common because it's easier, right? And it doesn't come from a place of harm. When most people are minimizing, it's because they want to see equality. They want to see people treated the same. Let's not talk about race. We don't need to talk about the fact that you're a woman. Let's just focus on that we're all human beings. Let's sing Kumbaya. And what that does is that further perpetuates inequities, because if you only see me for what you think we have in common, right, then you're not seeing all the parts that I bring that make me unique and different. You're not seeing all of my uniquenesses. And so when we have minimization policies in place, it's those colorblind, race neutral, right? Zero tolerance. And we need to be thinking about that. We need to be thinking like, okay, in my role, where might I be minimizing? Where might I be minimizing to create comfort, right, for others, right? I even think that people of color tend to minimize, right? I don't do it anymore, but I know I used to, when I was the only Black face in a white space, I would not want my Blackness to be an issue. And so I would couch it, right? I would suppress it. I would speak to the things that created shared comfort in the room. I stopped doing that. I'm 52 years old. I don't do that anymore, right? Now I'm like, no, I am a Black woman and I have things to say, right? Right. And so we have to make sure that we're not perpetuating minimization and that we're not allowing ourselves to be minimized, right? So, oops, my technology is just not cooperating. Okay, so here's some examples of minimization. I don't see color. I treat everyone the same, right? I don't see this culture stuff as important. It's simple. Just treat people with respect and there won't be any problems. Come on. We know that first one especially is not true. You see me, you see my color, right? And if a person is choosing not to see your color, it is just that, a choice, because it's more comfortable for them. And so that's minimization language. When we speak to this idea of, I don't see color, everybody's the same, we all bleed red, we need to stop doing that because not everybody is the same. Not all persons of color are a monolith. We need to honor the diversity. We need to recognize it. We need to welcome it. We need to expect it. We need to plan for it, right? And so that's why I say we have to stop minimizing. Okay, now you're probably saying, all right, well, now what? Here's the thing. There's three things that I think we should all be doing on a regular basis to help to impact the systems that we're a part of. We need to have awareness, we need to be reflective, and we need to be able to take action. Okay, so awareness. Hopefully my presentation today gave you some awareness of some things to think about differently. So we really want to continue to foster that, right? You want to continue to go out there and seek out information. And I mentioned earlier the 4 E's, right? The way that you build your awareness is that you increase your exposure to difference, right? So you make sure that you're exposing yourself to people who are different from you, different lived experiences, different values. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's just people, right? It could mean that you need to seek out that information. You need to watch documentaries, watch videos, even watching movies through the lens of what can I learn about a different culture that I had not known before. So exposure is very important. Experience. You really want to get those experiences of engaging with people who are different than you in rich and meaningful ways, right? And then getting education, learn something about what you don't know. And this goes for persons who are from the dominant culture as well. It is not the responsibility of people of color to share with you what our experiences are. You have a responsibility to go out there and to recognize this history and understand it and learn it and know the impacts of what's happening in today, right? If we do exposure, experience, and education well, it does a couple of things. To me, is a 5th E here. If you do exposure, experience, and education, you develop empathy, right? And I think what the world is really missing right now is empathy and grace. But when you think about it from a qualitative side, it also increases your effectiveness, right? If you can think about the impact of your organization, you can think about how it makes your organization better, right? And so that's why I want you to be thinking about, if you do nothing else, you want to walk away with 4 E's. I'm going to go get exposure, experience, education to build empathy so that I can be more effective, right? So I just made it 5 E's, but it's supposed to be 4. Okay. Reflection is, I think, hugely important. I do this work, and when you do the work of being an anti-racism educator and you're always talking about race, it can be really exhausting. And I have to do self-care sometimes and check out and go watch really dumb TV so I can allow my brain to rest, right? But it's because I think we have to spend time in reflection and think about the impacts both to us, because we're experiencing a lot of incoming, right? There's a lot of incoming. And so we have to have our shields and our barriers, and we have to be prepared to address what we see happening, right? And so I want people to be thinking about where they are on this continuum, and the reason, if I'm struggling with becoming anti-racist or being in environments where I'm challenging racism, what's holding me back? Is it fear? Is it that I need to learn more? Is it that I need to grow, right? And this is a continuum when you think about it. So I want folks to look at this and say, you're not going to reflect on, do I recognize racism as a present and current problem? Or do I seek out questions that make me uncomfortable, right? Am I able to educate my peers on how racism harms our profession? So really thinking through how you travel through this continuum, that's a reflective piece that has to happen within, right? So we can get to doing the external, the without changes. this document here, and I actually will share some of these resources because I see folks asking in the chat. So this is a continuum on becoming an anti-racist, multicultural institution. And it has value across any systems or industries. And I think people should take a look at this and say to your, say even in your organization, say, like, where are we? I mean, we may have a mission statement that says, you know, we're not racist, or, you know, that we stand with Black Lives Matter, which has been a thing. I got lots of calls from companies saying, can you help us write our statement? And I was like, yeah, I'll help you write it, but I want you to live it, right? It's not just putting it on paper. But this continuum really helps people to assess, where are we as an organization? Are we doing things in a passive way? Are we only doing symbolic change, right? Are we really going to get to identity change as an organization? And so there are some metrics here for you to analyze your organization. So I encourage folks to start there, to begin to say, who are we as an organization? Does what we espouse match what, you know, what we actually do, right? And so this is a really great way to see your organization and begin to think, okay, are we still, you know, limiting and excluding the people of color in our organization from the way that we, you know, enact policy? Or are we growing our understanding of racism as a barrier to effective diversity in our organization? So this is a really critical tool that I give to schools and corporations as they begin to have this conversation. I get calls that say, can you come and do anti-racism training? And the first thing out of my mouth is, how do you know that's what you need? And they'll say, okay, we want bias training. I say, nope, how do you know that's what you need, right? I want you to assess your organizations. I want you to look at both yourselves and then your work environments and say, well, where are we, so that we know how to build capacity to move us along this continuum. And I would also say too, one of the things I want you to think about is, you know, how do you decide who you bring to the table, right? Many of the folks that are in this session probably hold some positions of power. And even if you don't have a formal authority, formal power, you still have influence within your locus of control. Where and how do you hold that power right now to address the impacts of racism? Whose voices have you traditionally excluded from the conversation? Who has the systems or the challenges that you're facing within your locus of control? Who have they failed to serve, right? So if you're in banking or healthcare or education, who have we failed to serve? And then what does success look like in a redesigned system or practice? So I challenge folks to create a problem statement by defining the scope of change that you need to make based on prioritization, based on data from your respective industry, and based on self-reflection. I think every leader, every person that works in an organization should hold themselves accountable and say, what is the problem that we want to solve for, right? Because if you don't do that, you're trying to solve for too many things. It gets overwhelming, and guess what happens? We solve for nothing, right? So identifying what within my locus of control, here is one place that we can begin to affect change. What happens now is we get into the cycle of inaction sometimes, right? Something happens in society, you know, we say, oh my gosh, that's a horrific injustice, and we're shocked and confused. I mean, think about January 6th in the context of this graphic. We have an emotional response, and then we do the performative things, right? Have many organizations after George Floyd put out their statements about, you know, Black lives, right? And then, you know, so there's maybe some guilt, and then there's some fatigue, and then we move back into inaction and passivity and apathy. Instead, if we can really re-narrate this cycle of inaction, it would look like this. So when a horrific injustice takes place, we won't be overtaken by shock and confusion as if the fruit of systemic oppression is surprising, because it's not. Instead, our emotional response will be marked by empathy and compassion, leading to a rejection of the performative allyship in exchange for the real, rigorous work. And should guilt and fatigue try to settle in, we'll recenter the needs of those yearning for liberation, remembering that inaction and passivity are detrimental to justice, and that apathy is the antithesis of unconditional love. So if nothing else, we have to stop ourselves from just being like horrified and then falling back into our own worlds. Instead, we have to re-narrate, yes, rewrite the story of what we're trying to dismantle. And so I charge you all with creating that problem statement and the actions that you're going to take to address them. All right, I know I said a lot. I just talked for an hour straight. So I want to build in some time for some discussion. And so I know I have somebody that's going to manage the chat and let me know what the questions are.
And so I will assist here. I don't see Cornell on, so I'm going to go ahead and pull some questions that I see in the chat. please make sure you ask away. We've had a riveting, we've heard some really great information from Ms. Valda Valbrun, and I want to thank her again for that. So as I'm pulling questions, you're getting a lot of love, amazing work,
Thank
tremendous.
you.
Yeah, good stuff in the chat here. Feelings of empathy. And I'll just read a couple of the comments in as much as we'll wait for some questions to come up. It really is what is lacking, I think, responding to some of your comments. You have the technology and the resources to do what needs to be done, but the lack of will and empathy is what is holding us back.
Yeah.
And that's from Ms. Gomez.
I agree. You know, it's a lack of both will and skill in many cases, right? Because if you don't have the skill to address these inequities, if you're fearful of offending, right, and what ends up happening is that you resort to inaction. And so it's a skill and will thing that I think sometimes merges together. We've got to. I feel like my work is to create the skill, right, to give people the words, the tools, to give them the awareness, and then to charge them with now having the will to go back to their respective organizations and affect change. How do we reach out to Valda to get into speak? So I have a final slide that has my contact information that I'll share before I part ways with you all. So you'll be able to grab a quick picture of it. And you'll know how to locate me.
Yeah, and I think, you know, when we think about South Florida, you heard some presentations earlier about some of the work that's happening. I know Urban League is a supportive partner of some of the race and equity trainings that are taking place. And so having you, and I know that you're already speaking to some of the local folks to figure out what's possible. So I really embrace that idea that, you know, bringing experts like you to the table to continue to educate, because in as many race, equity, diversity, inclusion, events, trainings I've gone to, I feel like I learned something new here today as well. And so I really greatly appreciate your adding new information, the visual of the tree and it leaning and using the tree as a symbol for the system. That was the first time I've seen that. I've seen the children and behind the gate, but that was the first time I've seen that. And so thank you for sharing. Definitely shared some words that I'll be stealing and perhaps using. I hope you don't mind. I'll credit you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the other thing that I want people to think about is it's easy for us to stay in, you know, problem identification mode, right? Like we can spend all day, here's what's wrong, here's what's wrong, here's what's wrong. And I really challenge folks to think about, how do I move into a solution orientation mindset, right? How do I do something about it? I think we've been on the sidelines for too long. As persons of color, we've been marginalized, and we've begun to believe that on the sidelines is where we belong. And I want to encourage folks to recognize that we have a seat at the table. The fact that we're still having firsts, you know, in 2021, first Black vice president, first Black president, these first, yes, while we celebrate them, we should be outraged by the fact that in 2021, we still have so many barriers that need to be broken. And so I just want us to really think about, within your locus of control, where do you have power to dismantle systems? Where do you have power to pull that one cog out that will slow down those other systems, right? We often think that power is formal authority. And I always want to remind people that it is not. It is not. We all have within our control the ability to affect some change in our households, right? In our environments, in our communities, in our churches, and in our workplaces. And so I charge everybody to please consider to think about the ways in which you can do that. I see I'm reading some of the comments in the chat. Thank you so much. I've attended many training workshops, and this was by far the best. So thank you. Other questions? We got a few more minutes.
Yes, we do. Any additional questions from any of our participants?
Or comments,
Comments too.
Comments,
we love.
Thoughts.
Yes. Again, more comments about it being the best training they've attended on the topic. Really supporting this idea of being problem solvers versus being a part of the problem. And here's a new comment. Contact info. I know you'll share that on your final slides. That's coming up.
Yeah. I've heard that before. I've had some people ask me, when are you gonna do a TED Talk? I'm like, that's a process. I don't know if y'all know about that. That's no small feat. They take you through the ringer. Somebody asked if I could describe the work that the Valbrun Consulting Group does. Absolutely. So we do diversity, equity, and inclusion training, leadership development, and strategic planning with school districts and organizations. And I present at conferences, but I also like to encourage people to think about, how do you assess where you are as an organization? How do you assess readiness to even have these conversations? And so we do an assessment called the Intercultural Development Inventory as part of that work, where participants get to have take an assessment, but they also get a personalized one-on-one coaching call to unpack their results. It's really powerful when a whole organization does it, because then you have that data around who are we as an organization. Do we show up as organization that really fosters minimization, or are we accepting and adapting? Do we have policies that allow for us to truly be inclusive environments? And so, it's just one part of the work that we do. I mentioned that I'm a former educator and I was a school principal, and I've done all this work for many years in education. And what I found when I started my company some years ago was that, there's this way to marry helping people to think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the systems that it impacts, particularly education. But now I start to see how, what we're expecting schools to solve so many problems. You're seeing that what happened when we had to close schools. Everything came to a screeching halt, right? Parents can't go to work. All these different factors happen. Students aren't able to get meals. We recognize that the disparate technology, right? And so, I really began to expand helping people and organizations to think about the impacts of all these various systems, as well as education. But most of those systems do play out in the way that they filter into our schoolhouses.
There's a couple of questions in the chat. I can elevate them here. What would you recommend as the first step to reaching across the social lines to engage others that do not look like us and perhaps hold power that may be contributing to inequality?
Yeah, so a big part of it is to have the conversations, right? And I think people need to be honest and have those discussions. I'm working with some organizations that are doing affinity groups in the workplace, right? Allowing people of color to come together and have some discussions about their experiences, and then also meeting with racial ally groups and allowing them to hear these stories. I know I said earlier that it's not up to us to tell our stories, but I think that we have to be willing to tell them as well, right? And we have to really get them to think about the experience that they're creating for people that's different. Based on one employee and another. So it really starts with the conversations and giving people the tools, the language, the words to be able to have those conversations in productive ways. Let's see a question that's was there a particular incident that drove you to this work? So I like that question because I have a story. So I'm child of immigrants. My parents are from Haiti, and I was born in the United States. I'm the only one of my siblings that was born in this country. And if you know anything about Haitian culture, they like to send their kids to private schools, right? And here I am, a public educator, but I went to a Catholic school. And my Catholic school experience from K through 8, I was the only child of color. Okay. I mean, I know it sounds like you're like, really? Yes, the entire time, except for at 3rd grade, there was like 2 other kids that were also Haitian, by the way, and they actually did not stay. And so I often think back to that experience because even at that very young age, I recognized how this was not right. The way that I was being treated was not right. In 3rd grade, a nun asked me, she asked me to come to the front of the room. Back then we sat alphabetically, and my last name is Valbrun. So of course I was, seat number 35. The class was quiet. She asked me to come forward, and she said, "How did your mother keep you so clean?" Now I was 8 years old, right? 3rd grade, you're 8. And so I responded, she bathes me, she irons my uniform, that kind of thing. Now, in hindsight, at 50 something, I remember that story so clearly because I actually remember the experience of walking up to the front of the room when she called me forward. It's very vivid. And as an educator, I've always held on to that. I've always held on to what other students are going to walk away with a story that they're going to be telling when they're in their 50s about how they felt so marginalized and didn't realize, in that moment, I didn't realize it, but I carry that with me. And I've always carried it with me as an educator and as a person that speaks to others about the experience we're creating for not just children, but for others in this world, right? Everybody has a story. I mean, my story it sounds crazy, but we all have a story. If I were to say to you, think back to your story, that moment you realize that I'm different and I'm seen differently in the world, right? And yes, it's a trauma that we carry forward. And I took that trauma and I turned it into what I do now for a living, right? I was like, you know what? I'll be damned if I'm going to ever on my charge have a child have that kind of a story, right? Be educated by people who don't understand them, who don't see their value. I'm not even saying that nun was trying to cause me harm. In fact, she probably was being inquisitive because in her mind, a child of color should probably be dirty, should probably not be in private school, right? And so she was saying, geez, you're an anomaly. How does your mother keep you so clean? And so we have to educate people so that they would never think to ask that question, right? They would see how inappropriate it was. And granted, it was 40 some odd years ago. But I think that part of this creating cultural competence and creating in people the ability to understand difference and to recognize it and to see it as valuable and not as a deficit, that's a big part of that work. Because I never want a kid to feel the way that I felt in that moment that I still carry with me today.
Really good stuff. There's a question in the chat about other trainings you might recommend, maybe for someone who's trying to build the muscle for this. So are there other resources that you would recommend for folks?
Yes. So if you've not read, there's obviously I highlighted the How to Be an Anti-Racist as one place, but there's a book by Mary Frances Winters called Black Fatigue. We actually gave it out in a conference that I presented at recently, because I think what we're hearing this story narrated, not necessarily by voices or elevated by voices of color, right? And so I know like most organizations are reading Right Fragility, and I'm like, okay, you can read Right Fragility, but I also want you to read Black Fatigue. I want you to be able to hear those counter narratives, but also to hear them from the voices of people of color. The other thing that I recommend people do is that you spend some time, right? Because it's not like taking a course and that kind of thing. Yes, we should be watching documentaries. If you've not yet seen 13th, if you've not yet seen I Am Not Your Negro, because there's that historical context that I think people have to have when they do this work. They have to understand where we've been so they can see where we're repeating it, but also they can see the direction of where we need to head and what's contributed to where we are now. So I think that it's about reading the appropriate text. I think it's about watching documentaries. It's also, though, sharpening your lens and your ear, right? I tell people that I want things to land on them differently because they've established a level of wokeness, right? And it could be as simple as like, I'm going to tell you a goofy story. So I watched two romantic comedies, Always Be My Maybe and Crazy Rich Asians.
Yeah.
Now they're both great. I giggled the whole time. However, the two of them juxtapose Asian cultures. And so there's a lot to learn, even about people who are different than you, who have a different lived experience from you, even if it's just from watching a romantic comedy. Always Be My Maybe is written by Randall Park, and it was done specifically to challenge our notions of what we think of as the model minority, right? As the Asian culture, smart and wealthy and into technology and good at math. And so it was designed to counter the narrative about what we think about as stereotypes. Crazy Rich Asians, you got to see some of those stereotypes play out, but you also have to see the beautiful parts of the country and the culture and tradition and that kind of thing. And so I always challenge people to even do that, to watch television, to watch romantic comedies, to watch documentaries, but do it in the sense of, what can I learn about people who are different from me? What are my takeaways? What can I challenge? How can I re-narrate, create a different story than what I've traditionally been told? And I think we also have to kind of think about when we remove judgment from what we tend to think of our belief systems, right? And just say what we really see, what's in front of us. I sometimes show a video clip of a woman that walks into a room barefooted behind a man who has on shoes, and she sits on the floor and he sits on a stool. There's no words, and he bows her head down, and then he eats something, like he pretends to eat, and he hands it to her. And then I ask people, what did you just see? And they go crazy. Human trafficking, subordination, all these different, like, really negative terms. And so I said, is that what you saw? And I'm like, because a story happens in their head. And I said, that's not what you saw. What you saw was an amalgamation of religious ceremonies, right? He walked in before her because he was holding her in high esteem. He ate before her to make sure she wasn't poisoned. She was barefooted because in some cultures, only a woman can have that kind of reverence and be close to the earth. He bowed her head because he was praying through her. And when you don't know these things, right, you have this negative story that happens in your mind because it's different than what we do. And so it's really about, how do I sharpen my lens so that when somebody says, what do you see here? You say, I don't know enough about that culture. I need to learn more, versus oh, that's bad and that's terrible. My goodness. Right. And so I see folks are putting some movies in the chat. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Right. And so I always get to send people a reading list and a watching list, because that's the way that we sharpen our lens. That's the way that we build empathy. When I say to get exposure, it doesn't mean let me go find a new Black friend or a new Jewish friend. It's really about how do I expose myself to things that are going to close my gaps and help me build better understanding.
It's interesting. There's a comment up above around mindset change. So the inquiry is related to how do you help people change mindset in this area?
So that's a tough one, right? And I often say to people that my work is about changing the behaviors and not necessarily the beliefs, right? Because you will exhaust yourself trying to change people's beliefs, because beliefs are grounded in, what your parents told you, right? Like how you've experienced the world, your worldview. I was recently doing a session with some teachers, and a teacher said, white privilege doesn't exist. And you can hear the collective gasp in the room, like, right? And I said, let me give you 2 words to add to that sentence, and I'll let you keep telling your story. And she said, okay, I'm game. And I said, for me. And she said, I said, say it again. She said, white privilege doesn't exist for me. I said, continue, right? And then she told her story. And come to find out, as we unpacked it, right, she was talking about being, growing up in poverty and her being daughter of a coal miner and that kind of thing. And I said, did you go to college? Yes. Did you get scholarships? Yes. I said, okay. I said, so tell me again, your first sentence. She says, oh, maybe I did experience some privilege, right? And so getting people to even re-narrate some of the language that they use. I have a couple of like my little key terms, right? I always say, might I offer you a counter perspective? Right? That's my little go-to phrase. Might I offer you a counter perspective? And so I'm asking for permission to now share with you an alternative view, right? To offer you another way to think about it. And so it's that kind of, I don't try to change beliefs, but I do try to change behaviors in the moment, right? By offering a counter narrative. A lot of people don't realize that they're functioning from these narratives that we've been told for so long, right? And so saying, like, let me offer you another perspective and sharing some history. When people say, well, I don't understand why, there's not more Black home ownership. And I say, well, let me offer you another perspective. If you think about, systems of redlining and generational wealth, and how the GI Bill was only offered to white GIs. And so they were able to come and buy homes in neighborhoods that were set aside for them. And they were able to pass down that wealth to their children, and the children were able to go to college without debt, right? And people say, oh, I hadn't thought about that, right? And so a big part of it is us educating the people around us who it's not that they're trying to cause harm, they just don't know, right?
Yeah, I think that is tough, right? It takes coming from a brave position at times to have some of these conversations. And so I'm curious about approach. We have about 10 minutes left in this engagement with you, and we may tap out a little bit earlier so that we're on time for the luncheon speaker. But I do think approach has a lot to do with it, right? It's easy to get argumentative in some of these conversations. Many of us are coming from families that may very well be diverse. Sometimes there's colorism and racism. And, I think some of these conversations are challenging to have, particularly as you say, changing mindset is tough. Maybe changing behaviors is interesting. And it takes some level of educating people. Is there a thought related to a softening or an approach to have with people when engaging in, tough conversations?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a quick little narrative. I had a gentleman, I was doing a 4-part series, and he was in like part 2, had been with me for part 1 and 2. And he made a comment, and I challenged him on it. He said something about children from it was at schools. And he said, well, it's fact that the kids who live in, and he named the zip code, aren't as well equipped as the kids who go to this school. And so, I always have to maintain a stance of not making people feel threatened, which is hard. As a Black woman, you don't want to come off as, the whole, don't want to be the angry Black woman talking about race, right? And so that's why I have my arsenal prepared with terminology like, might I offer you another perspective, right? And so I said to him in that moment, I said, you said that out loud, right? And he said, yeah, I said it out loud. I said, so you're okay with me giving you a yes and or a yes, but? He said, sure. And so I challenged him on his thinking. And at the end of the class, he came up to me and he says, I don't think I want to be in the 3rd session with you. And I said, That's great. I said, actually invite you to find another instructor for this particular module. I said, but I will tell you this, it is really important for, even if it's not me who's challenging your thinking, you challenge your own thinking. And I invite you to take this course with anybody else. But please know that if you're going to put in the space that children of color are less capable than children from dominant cultures, no matter who the instructor is, it's their responsibility to challenge that, particularly because this person was an educator. And I said, and it worries me that you sit in front of children who probably experienced that belief. So there's gonna be those times where, I have to use plain language and to let somebody know. I think we should all be able to do that, right? We should all be able to find the words. Why I said that a lot of what I do is giving people the language. We started with how words matter, that we can't have these conversations with grace and empathy if we don't have the right words. And it may not be comfortable, and people may walk away and say, I don't want to come to your class anymore. And that's okay, right? So.
No, it's a good point. While we have about 5 minutes left, don't know if there are any others who want to put any comments in the chat, or even Valda, if you have any final words for those who are participating in today's discussion.
Well, I would just say, that this is hard work. It's been 400 years of this. We can't fix this overnight, but I do want everybody to find that one thing they can do in their role, right? In your environment, in your work environment, in your home environment, in the way that we raise our children even, right? I have a daughter who's a senior at Spelman, and I love the fact that she's got to be in an environment with other women of color. It has totally changed her. She went to a very white high school, and she was worried initially about even fitting in. So even in the way we raise our kids, what we expose them to and help them to build the capacity to have the words in the language, that's how we affect the future, right? Allowing them to know their worth so they will challenge situations where they're being marginalized, where they can recognize and ask for what they need. And we got to create these brave, safe spaces. So absolutely. And again, I just want to say thank you for the time today. I feel like I love having these conversations. This is not work for me. This is like my passion, right? And so if anybody does want to reach out to me, you can follow me on those socials. And I saw somebody earlier put my website in the chat. But by all means, and if you can send a tweet about today's presentation, I would love it, and tag at Valbrun Consults. And if you can specifically tweet one thing you learned today, that would be amazing for me. So, and I will hit Twitter up and see them later on, and I'll do some retweeting and refollowing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again, Valda. We so appreciate you getting lots of love in the chat, and I concur. Thank you so much for your time, energy, and passion. We've learned a lot today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.